Hey guys, in this video I wanted to talk about the role of TRPV family receptors, TRPV 1 and 2, which are essentially, they're most well known as being the receptors on our tongue that sense hot and cold sensations. But they're actually a lot more interesting than that in certain ways. Notably, they are also used in sensing hot and cold conditions for thermoregulation purposes. And for example, even, stuff like heat and cold pain. This may seem at first surprising that, they share a functional group based on this analogy, but the fact is taste evolved only 500 million years ago or so, and life has been around a lot longer. So what happened with these families of receptors on our taste buds is they actually got repurposed from other families of from other chemosensory receptors that were already in use for much more ancient things. For example, basically all life needs to do things like maintain, be able to sense heat and cold, be able to maintain heat and cold homeostasis. This is one of the most basic types of challenges. It's not very surprising that this type of sensing would be repurposed, but it has all sorts of interesting implications. But the thing I wanted to talk about is, first of all, what do these receptors do? Because they are based on, they still have effects grouped based on the original uses. What I mean by this is, for example, the TRPV hot receptors tend to trigger a cascade of effects that cause, for example, vasodilation, swelling or inflammation, and decreased metabolism, which are all responses to heat. Some of these are responses to touching something that burns us. Some of these are responses to just hotter conditions, climates, where we no longer need to expend resources. TRPV cold receptors essentially signal the opposite homeostasis mechanisms. They signal vasoconstriction, they signal increased heart rate, they signal increased metabolism, like you would find in a cold habitat. So these are, but what's very interesting about this is the traditional medicine system in India, Ayurveda, tended to use these taste characteristics, what they called rasas, as heuristics for finding herbs that might trigger a certain dosha, which are kind of the main categories of effects. So for example, Vata dosha is when they start looking for herbs to trigger it, they recommend first looking for things that have a cold and bitter rasa. This may seem quite weird and surprising, but I won't talk about the role of bitter here. It's not as strongly evidenced, but it's also, in lower sugar conditions, we use more metabolism than when we have resources and nutrients. And unsurprisingly, Vata is actually stimulatory in nature. But also, it stimulates, bitter actually detects unrecognized chemosensory states. So, it triggers kind of xenometabolism, immune systems, things like this. Now, the type of, this may seem surprising that they would use this as kind of heuristic for mining for things, although it obviously is. They even group substances by their post-digestive taste, their post-digestive arousal, their vipaka, which makes, seemingly very little sense. However, what is actually going on with this is, not everything that fits the cold receptor on the tongue fits the cold receptor on the body. It's just a way of finding related plants that produce related shapes of chemicals. Some might attach to the receptors on the tongue, some might not. But plants tend to produce chemicals in families of related shapes. And, the way this is done includes stuff like combining dozens of includes dozens of sorry you know it can be hard to hit these receptors with just a single herb, but a traditional herbal medicine, it may be dozens of things with the same browser combined, trying to attack a certain dosha, and these doshas do seem to be related to the rasas, is what's quite interesting. So, for example, the most counterintuitive thing in Ayurveda is that the next dosha, Pitta, is actually associated. It's the fire and earth dosha, but fire we think of kind of like increased metabolism, stuff like that. Pitta is actually associated with slowing down of metabolic processes, which doesn't make sense until you realize, these people who believed in the elements started noticing that perhaps hot substances were correlated with certain effects. And when we think of it instead of as fire, as the effect of kind of mimicking homeostasis mechanisms in hotter conditions, we can actually see why Pitta would slow things down. So this is just a hypothesis about how the dosha system originated, but I think while experimenting and looking for heuristics, they started noticing hot substances and cold substances, although it's not always true. If you put them together in a broad categorization, they do seem to have certain correlations with certain types of effects, which, of course, in an elemental worldview, made them think that they had discovered some kind of relationship to the elements, probably resulting in the dosha classification. Now, rasas are not always equally strongly associated with the doshas, but for example, in the case of Vata, the association of cold and bitter is very strong. Similarly, Pitta is very strongly associated with hot. So I just find it interesting how Ayurveda may use this analogy. And one thing that's interesting is the role and repurposing of these TRPV receptors is so broad that it may even be associated with the mind-body connections of traditional medicine. The reason I say this is these same TRPV receptors, which are found in sensing cold and heat pain, are found in the sensing of emotional pain. It's even, yeah. And, in a way, this is unsurprising because the emotion of fear, for example, feels cold. Shame feels hot. And they both trigger cascades of processes which are very similar. So it's an exciting avenue of research that should be looked into more, what the exact relationship between kind of rasas and emotional effects are, and whether this can have any use in people with trauma. Yeah. Thank you guys for listening.